most famous part of the book of Joshua this morning, Joshua 6, as you heard it read, the Battle of Jericho, and the walls come tumbling down. Very famous indeed, although there was a pastor of a church who was rather shocked at the ignorance of some of the children in his church. He was a new pastor, so he thought he'd go and visit the Sunday school one Sunday, and so a little boy, Johnny, greeted him, and he said, "Oh, we're studying Joshua." And the pastor said, "Oh, that's good, so tell me, who is responsible?" Oh, is that back to me now? Or is it?
No,
who?
I just heard it.
Oh, okay. The pastor said, "So tell me, who's responsible for the walls of Jericho falling down?" And the little lad looked a bit alarmed, but he said quite definitely, "I don't know, Pastor, but it wasn't me. I didn't tell you." So he was a little sort of shocked at that, but anyway, he let it pass the pastor. But later in the day, he mentioned to the chairman of the board of elders that he'd been in the Sunday school, and that a little boy didn't even know who. He said, "I asked him," and he said, "Well, I don't know, but it certainly wasn't me." And this is quite serious, really. Well, the chairman of the elders thought for a moment. He said, "Look, Pastor, I really don't think it's worth making a fuss about this. I suggest we just get 2 or 3 quotations and let's get the job done ourselves." Well, I'm sure there's not that sort of ignorance in our congregation today. If you asked our children, I'm sure they would say the right answer. They'd probably say Joshua, because, well, we've heard it now. And obviously there's the song. I think most of us know the song. You know, Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. But if there's one thing that we should learn from this passage today as we study it, here's a unique event in the history of the people of God when God acted in a miraculous way, and it was God who brought the walls of Jericho down. Not Joshua, not the soldiers, not the people marching around, but it was miraculously brought down by God. Of course, the people and Joshua and the soldiers had to follow God's instructions. They were obedient to his command, but it was a miracle, and it was God who was responsible. But anyway, before we get on to the lessons that we can learn for our own Christian walk, perhaps, and what we can learn from this passage this morning, I know that there are really 2 problems in a way, if we're honest, 2 problems about this account that we have to face, to try and answer. The first problem is a historical problem, and the second is a moral problem, if you like. 2 problems. The historical problem, what do I mean by that? Well, when did these walls fall down? When did it all happen? It's not a big deal, but I think we need to mention it, especially if you're interested in this. And you may or may not know, it doesn't really matter to you perhaps, because you just know the story. But actually, there has been a big debate amongst archaeologists and biblical scholars, especially liberal scholars, about this whole account and about the reliability of this account in Joshua. In fact, up to about 25 years ago, the general view was that this account was simply a story, because all the archaeological evidence pointed otherwise, that this couldn't be really taken seriously. That was up to about 25 years ago. The general view was to agree with a famous British archaeologist named Kathleen Kenyon, who had excavated the site of the ancient Jericho in the 1950s and concluded that there could have been no walled city in the 14th century BC when this account is supposed to have taken place. The city, she said, archaeological evidence pointed to the fact that it had been destroyed at least 2 centuries before, and so Kenyon claimed that Jericho was destroyed in the 16th century, and so there was no walled city there at Tel Es Sultan, as it was known then, or now, for Joshua to conquer. But that was 25 years ago. Another scholar, and other scholars came on the scene, and a scholar called Bryant Wood and other archaeologists surveyed Kenyon's evidence. And in the last 25 years or so, the opinion has shifted, as it has in many cases of, people have dismissed things in the Old Testament especially. There's no such thing as this. They couldn't write, they couldn't do this. But actually, archaeology and history have proved otherwise and have substantiated the reliability of the Old Testament. Well, Wood and other archaeologists have pointed to the evidence and said that actually, no, there was a walled city. There's no reason to believe that there wasn't a walled city at Jericho until about 1400 BC. And when it was destroyed in a conquest strikingly similar to the biblical account, that would seem to suggest that we should revise Kenyon's earlier skepticism. This new evidence is based on examination of pottery items and the site and the nature of the walls, and the revised date is now around about 1400 BC, which would match the chronology, the history that's presented in the Bible. Well, it's not conclusive, but I think it's interesting. The debate, as so often happens, goes on, and it's interesting to note that what is often accepted as the assured findings of archaeology in the 1950s is now quite generally challenged, and a later date is being accepted for the destruction of Jericho. Well, as I say, you might be interested in that or not. You can read all about it on the internet. You can just Google the conquest of Jericho and you'll find arguments both ways and back. But that's the first problem. I'm just mentioning it because you might, even the kids, they might come across it in school, and you can't rely on the Old Testament and so on. Well, okay, the arguments are still going back and forth, but it's not conclusive. And there's reason to believe that we can believe the account in Joshua here. That's the first problem. The second problem, I would say, is much more serious and more difficult to answer, and that's the moral problem posed by this story and by the whole conquest. Because what do I mean by the moral problem? Well, I'm sure, again, you've heard statements, this is more likely, of course, when you've been talking to non-Christians and to skeptics and so on, atheists perhaps, people who don't believe in the Bible, you hear statements like, how on earth can you believe in the God of the Old Testament? The God who sort of authorized violence and bloodshed and genocide and all these atrocities and this sort of thing that we're thinking about in Joshua, the destruction of these cities and these people, seems to have all been authorized by God. Is God a monster, a moral monster, who orders the destruction of men and women and children like this? What sort of God is that, people say? Not the sort of God we want to worship. I don't adore that sort of God. And furthermore, of course, some would say it's not the sort of God that is presented in the New Testament through the teachings and the life of Jesus. So this problem, this question, is God a moral monster? How do we deal with that? Well, now, of course, that is a massive question. It requires more than just a minute or two response from me that I can give here this morning, but I'm just raising it, and again, there's lots of helpful articles online. If you wanted to follow this up, there are good books by Christian theologians, a book like The God I Don't Understand by an English Christian theologian, Dr. Chris Wright, in which he engages with this sort of problem, this argument, and other difficult aspects of some of the biblical revelation of God, the question of evil, problem of suffering, why does God allow this and that and so on. You can follow that up yourself, but let me say two things this morning briefly about the second problem, the moral difficulty, if you like, as we come face to face with it in this account today. I think the first thing we need to say simply is this: yes, for some of these issues, the problem of suffering and so on, there are no easy answers. We don't pretend as Christians to know all the answers. And to this objection, there's no easy answer. And it doesn't do us any good. It doesn't do the people that we're trying to speak to any good if we just deny it and say, well, there's not a problem here. There are things about God, about faith, about the biblical revelation that, if we're honest, we don't completely understand. We don't have all the answers to it. And although there are good arguments that we can put forward and explanations, that might partially help us, at the end of the day, that is what they are. They are partial explanations. Because you see, I think we have to be humble enough to acknowledge that we are finite. We are limited in our knowledge. Our perspective is earthbound, and we simply do not know all the answers. We are not God. And so we have to acknowledge we don't know all the answers. But I think the second thing we can say about this problem, particularly here, this conquest, is that we need to see this incident and the conquest of the land in the whole of the Old Testament context. I know some people treat it like that, and they say, well, the revelation of God is progressive. That's how they understood God in the Old Testament, and then by the time we get to the New Testament, we have a better and a fuller picture of God and his character in Jesus and so on. Well, yes, I agree with that to a certain extent, but you can't use the progressive revelation argument to completely whitewash what's going on here. But I think if you see it in the whole context of God's sovereignty and God's plan for his people, then it does help a little bit. What we see, I think, here is that it's a one-off, unique incident in the history of the Israelites. It's not a way of ongoing life. It's not the modus operandus of this people. It's not God giving carte blanche for all sorts of violence and wars and so on. According to the Old Testament writers, here is an example of the patience of God finally running out. And so he is exacting a long-threatened warning judgment on the people of Canaan. And I can say that because as far back as Genesis 15 and verse 16, God says to Abraham that he would not see in his time the conquest of Canaan, because God says, in his many words, I'm giving them time. They are sinful people, but it's not your time now, Abraham, to go in and occupy the land. The sin of the Amorites, says in Genesis 15:16, has not reached its full measure. In other words, they, in a sense, they deserved it, but they didn't deserve punishment right now. God was giving them time. It was coming, but it wasn't the right time. That's back in Abraham's time. So the people of Israel waited, if you like, or God waited, for another 400 years before the sins of the Amorites, as it were, had reached their full measure, to use the language of Genesis 15. So in a way, God has been patient. He's waited 400 years before he took action against these wicked tribes, the Amorites and the people of Canaan. And listen, when he did, he used a less than perfect Israel. It's not that Israel was perfect. He used a less than perfect Israel to carry out his judgments on a people whose national morality in ways was known even in those days to be barbaric and unusually evil. So the conquest here is presented as the long-standing warning of God coming to its fruition, God's judgment. The Canaanites, the other tribes in the land, they were proverbial in their immorality. They practiced child sacrifice, they practiced incense, bestiality, and other behaviors that almost everyone in history would rightly regard as unspeakably and grossly immoral. And just as Israel here, as a one-off, was used as God's instrument of judgment, it wasn't because Israel was special. Later, Assyria and Babylon would also be used as God's instrument as judgment on the Israelites themselves, because they continued to be disobedient to God and they were carried off into captivity. That's why, interestingly, in Deuteronomy 9, before Moses dies, he tells him that the Israelites very clearly should not take any credit themselves for the conquest of the land. Listen to what he says in Deuteronomy 9, verse 4 to 6. Do not say to yourselves, the Lord has brought me here to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. No, it is on account of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you. It's not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you are going in to take possession of the land, but on account of the wickedness of these nations. The Lord your God will drive them out before you and accomplish what he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So, I think at the very least we can say this is not racism, this is not genocide, this is the judgment of a just and a holy God who is sovereign and who is pure in all his ways. He's also patient. And even if we sometimes cannot understand why he allows things to happen, the Old Testament itself, not just the New Testament, the Old Testament itself tells us that God is not a cruel, despotic, unpredictable, capricious, brutal, immoral being. Far from it. That's not his character. He is kind, he is just, he is patient. He revealed himself to Moses, and these words are repeated in many of the Psalms later in the worship of Israel. He is the Lord, compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, forgiving wickedness and rebellion and sin, and yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. Exodus 34, 6 and 7. He does not leave the unrepentant. They will meet his punishment, his judgment. So, we don't have all the answers. I'm not saying that's a conclusive riposte, but God is not a moral monster. At the end of the day, God is sovereign. He gives life, and he has the right to take it away. And he is loving and patient, but he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He is just, and to leave the guilty unpunished would be to undermine his justice and his holiness, to deny his holiness. And so here, I think, is one sort of explanation of what's going on here in the conquest. God's patience runs out, if you like, and these people are brought to judgment. Well, we could say much more on this second problem, but time is going, and as I say, you can look it up and perhaps follow this up yourself. But I think it's necessary to mention some of these things as we're looking at the book of Joshua. But let's move on, and just let's consider then three principles or three lessons that I think we can learn for our own benefit here as we look at this very famous account before we come to the Lord's table. What's the first thing? Well, I think there's a great lesson here that we need to experience God's presence. We need to experience God's presence. We see that particularly to do with Joshua as a leader, but it's true for us all as we seek to follow God and follow Jesus. We didn't read this because it's at the end of the previous chapter, but just let me read this to you. Chapter 5, verse 13. Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up, and he saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied. You see, that's interesting, isn't it? He's not on anybody's side. The main thing is, are we on his side? "Neither," he said, "but as commander of the army of the Lord I have now come." So Joshua fell face down on the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. Now, certainly as you hear those words, I'm sure that will jog your memory. Because this incident is very similar, isn't it, to something that happened to Moses. Remember? Remember that episode of Moses in the desert and the burning bush? God spoke to Moses and he told him to take off his sandals, take off his shoes, because the place he was standing was holy ground. Why? Well, God was meeting with Moses. God gave Moses a revelation of something of his glory and of himself before he was to begin his ministry, to go back to the people of Israel in Egypt and to Pharaoh and so on. It was a huge assurance to Moses that God was with him. And here I think it's the same for Joshua. This vision, many scholars believe that this is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus, because Joshua was not told to stand up and not worship him. Well, maybe that is. He's the captain of the Lord of hosts, of the armies of the Lord. The vision is designed to assure Joshua before he begins his great assault, before he leads the people into battle. This is Joshua's burning bush, if you like. And what an assurance that must have been the night before. And the principle, the lesson, the application surely for us is this, that if we want to know God's power in our lives, we want to be able to live for God, to fulfill his will. If we want to know God's power in our public life and be faithful to him, we need first to know his presence in private, in our private lives. Public victories are the result of private visits, of time spent with God in private, before we go out to war, as it were, in the spiritual sense, before we go out to live for God day by day, to fulfill his purposes and his mission for our lives. Before we go out to war, we need to worship. We need to spend time in God's presence. Otherwise, we will find our strength is small and we will be ineffective. We cannot bypass this experiencing of God's presence daily as we seek to be faithful to him. So, worship before warfare. Don't let's go into the warfare of daily life following Jesus unless we first worshipped and be assured of his presence and of his power with us. Worship before warfare, consecration before conquest. Experience God's presence. Do we value those times? Do we seek those times privately to experience God's presence before we go out and about and live for him? That's the first thing I see here. Then secondly, embrace God's plan. That's the second principle, or the second lesson, the application that I think we can see here in this account. We must embrace God's plan, experience his presence, and then follow his plan. In other words, do things God's way. Do things God's way. That's the obvious lesson we learn here, isn't it? From this rather, very strange military strategy that Joshua and the soldiers and the people of God were to follow. I mean, okay, we know the story now, so perhaps it's a bit familiar, but can you imagine the scene? In the big tent, the Israelites' high command, all the generals or whatever are waiting for Joshua to come and tell them what's the plan of assault going to be. There they are waiting for instructions, the leaders of the people. They're looking forward to this cunning strategy that Joshua's devised. There's going to be a siege of this city, of this town for a few weeks or so, and then we'll move in the night and there'll be a pincer movement from the north and the south, and we'll do this, that and the other. They're waiting. What's the strategy going to be? What's the plan? And Joshua walks in and he says, okay boys, here's the plan. We're going to walk around the city a lot of times. We're going to be blowing our trumpets, but we mustn't say a word. Don't say a word for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, let's walk around it 7 times. And then when I say shout, you shout. And the walls will come down. What? Are you mad? That's what they're thinking, surely. Joshua's been on the cactus juice. I mean, what sort of strategy is that? Walking around in silence, blowing trumpets, and then shouting. Well, that's the whole point, isn't it? It's God's plan, and victory will come doing it God's way, not our way. So the glory will go to God. That's the point. It's God's army, and it's God's victory. And he'll give the victory, and without him we can do nothing. The people are nothing. And the question for us, and for the people I suppose, but the question for us spiritually is, are we on God's side or not? You see, that was interesting that the captain of the Lord of hosts, he said, listen, I'm not on, Joshua said, are you for us or for the enemy? He said, neither. The big question is, are we on God's side? Are we walking God's way? Are we doing it according to God's plan? Because if we're not, then we've got no power. Are we following his instructions to live life to his glory? And again, just imagine, you can think, can't you, how after a few days of people walking around, blowing trumpets in silence, well, the people of Jericho might begin to laugh at these Israelites. Okay, the first day was a bit of a novelty and they were looking. Maybe the second, but then the third and the fourth day, what on earth are these people doing? What on earth will marching around achieve? And so they begin to laugh at them and say, look at these people, how ridiculous they are. But the Israelites continued in their obedience to God, to Joshua and to God. And I think there's a lesson there, isn't there? Many times, as Christians, we can be mocked by the world because of the way we're doing things. We're marching to the beat of a different drum. You're living in a different way because you're doing things God's way. And it's a way that often doesn't make much sense to the world. But you're following God. You're being faithful to him. You're being obedient to the commander of the Lord's army. And he is the one who will bring you victory. So, experience God's presence, embrace God's plan, and thirdly and finally, enjoy God's pardon. I think that's one of the gems of this story, isn't it? It's a wonderful truth that we have right here in the middle of this account of battle and of judgment and darkness, in a sense. There's this picture of grace, this wonderful picture of grace in Rahab's rescue. Joshua said to the two men who'd spied out the land, go into the prostitute's house and bring her out and all who belong to her in accordance with your oath to her. And so they brought out her entire family and they put her in a place outside the camp of Israel, in a safe place. So against this painful background of judgment and the fall of Jericho, the grace of God shines brightly in this example of Rahab, isn't it? Because, you see, the amazing thing is not actually that God should judge anyone. That's precisely what God should do and will do. He is a just and holy God. Rather, the amazing thing is that he should save anyone. Rahab didn't deserve to be saved, really, but she was saved. She didn't earn it, but she was saved by God's grace. And it's the same for us. You know, the amazing thing is not so much that people will face judgment and eternal punishment unless we repent. The amazing thing is that any of us will get to be in God's heaven at all. We have no right before God. We have no right to be with him in his perfect place. We spend our lives ignoring him by and large. We offend his holiness. We disobey his laws. We dishonor him and so on. We have nothing. We have nothing to give to him. We can expect nothing from him. But in his grace and his mercy, he holds out that hand of rescue. How? Well, he has come to rescue us. And as Jesus died on that cross, both the judgment of God and the grace, the mercy of God are seen in that act of rescue. His judgment in rightly punishing human rebellion, human sin, in all its horror and evil and disobedience. There's his judgment, but his grace, in that it is God himself, in the person of Jesus Christ, his only Son, who steps into our place and takes our judgment for us, dies for us. That is staggering grace, staggering love. And it should cause us to stop and wonder and praise and worship him. Yes, okay, the judgment of God might give us reason to ask questions, even of God himself. We don't have all the answers, but the grace of God, clearly revealed to us, the grace of God should cause us to shut our mouths in utter awe and wonder and amazement, and bow our knees and cry out to him in gratitude for his forgiveness. There is no reason to save you and me other than his amazing love and his wonderful grace. We deserve his judgment and his punishment, but God reaches out to save us. And here we see it in a little picture, as it were, of rescue of Rahab amongst all the judgment. And it's God's rescue, God's love, God's mercy that we celebrate now as we come to this table. We take this bread, we take this wine, and by his Spirit, in our spirits, as we take the bread and wine, we experience his presence. This is not some sort of morbid memorial feast. Jesus is alive. He's risen from the dead. And we believe his presence is amongst us. And as we take the bread and wine, we sense his presence by his Spirit. We embrace his plan. This amazing plan of rescue that has included us. So we enjoy his pardon. We give thanks afresh for what it is to know his forgiveness. And as we do so, in our spirits, in our hearts, those walls, which are barriers in our lives, keeping us from the fullness of joy that we discover when we're fulfilling his purposes, those walls come down as we bow in worship and adoration and thanksgiving for this rescue from judgment that we can experience and enjoy. So we're going to take the bread and the wine now, and as we just prepare the table, as the group come forward, just considering your own hearts, let's ask God to, you might know the reality of his presence today. This is not just some empty ritual to take this bread and wine, but that it's real and living in our own hearts and lives.